Hi, this is Len Edgerly in Sanibel, Florida, and this is the 723rd episode of the Kindle Chronicles podcast coming to you on Tuesday, February 11th, 2025. This episode contains a conversation I recorded by Zoom 4 days ago on February 7th, 2025, with Deb Miller Landau, author of a powerful book published in August of last year about the 1987 murder of Lita McClinton, a 35-year-old black woman in Atlanta, Georgia. Lita was gunned down at her home by a hitman hired by her estranged white husband, Jim Sullivan. The title of Deb's book is A Devil Went Down to Georgia, Race, Power, Privilege, and the Murder of Lita McClinton. It was published by Pegasus, an imprint of Simon & Schuster. One of the best summaries of Deb's book that I've seen came from Oprah Daily, which chose A Devil Went Down to Georgia as the #1 pick in an article titled 29 Best True Crime Books That'll Make You Want to Sleep with the Lights On. The Oprah Daily description was as follows. At 8:15 in the morning, Lita McClinton, a black socialite in, quote, the richest, whitest neighborhood in all of Atlanta, unquote, was murdered on her doorstep by a stranger carrying a box of long-stemmed pink roses and a Smith & Wesson. The date was January 6, 1987, and the victim was scheduled to settle her divorce from her white millionaire husband later that day. While on the surface this may look like a tragically common tale of male violence and human greed, Landau situated Lita's death within the context of the changing racial and sexual dynamics of her time and of ours. In the wake of #MeToo and the swell of protests over the murder of George Floyd, Landau returns to the case she had first covered in the early 2000s, eager to see how her original perspective and the case files she had not been able to part with for more than 20 years looked under the light of, quote, this new day of reckoning, unquote. With a journalist's eye, a novelist's vivid evocation of character, and some chilling interviews with the recently released hitman, Landau brings Lita to life on the page and calls the people and forces responsible for her death to account. I began my conversation with Deb Miller Landau by asking her to tell us about Jim Sullivan and Lita McClinton and how they met.
So Jim Sullivan and Lita McClinton met in 1976. And at the time, Lita was 25 and Jim was 35. And Lita had grown up in the South in Atlanta as part of a pretty powerful, politically powerful Black family. She just graduated from Spelman. She was working at a boutique in one of the high-end malls here. And, in walks Jim Sullivan, who is from Boston, sort of 10 years her senior, kind of a quirky looking guy. And he's just absolutely taken with Lita. And this is a time where, Georgia's anti-miscegenation laws that forbade, interracial marriage had just passed. And so it was kind of not a common sight at the time to see an interracial couple. But Jim and Lita sort of fell hard for each other and kind of had a whirlwind romance, and then got married in just a few months after they met.
I mean, he's a quirky looking guy, and I was seeing that in some of the photos. He wasn't a big guy. He was I don't know if you could say he looked charming. You describe him as charming and affable. But when you see what happened in this story and how dark it got, was there a time when this guy is somebody you could fall in love with and he'd have aspects of his character that weren't just completely evil?
Well, I think, this is one of the great things about perspective of time and why it's so interesting to come back and look at this story again all this time later, because you can see things that maybe you couldn't see at the time and maybe didn't even have a language for. So I think Jim was probably a classic narcissist. He was very, very smart, as a child and as a teenager and as an adult, and shrewd, and had, ability to sort of access a level of charm. And if Jim wanted you to like him, you kind of did. And so I think he was very sort of savvy on how, he today we would call it love bombing, the way he was with Lita, and just sort of completely showered her with love and attention and gifts and all the things that a young woman, is kind of like, wow, this is amazing. And then, also had the ability to have it go dark really quickly. So if Jim decided that, he didn't want to, be wooing you anymore, it just was like a very sudden darkness that took over. So that's sort of what happened. And Jim had come from Boston and inherited his uncle's liquor distributorship in Macon, Georgia. And soon after he came down, the uncle died, leaving Jim his, now worth millions company. So Jim was sort of this new money millionaire. And the night before Jim and Lita got married, he kind of let it slip to her that, oh, here's a prenuptial agreement to sign, but also I was married before and I have 4 children. And this came as a total shock to her. They were both Catholic, and but it would sort of like the flowers were purchased, the guests were here. Let's go through with it. And so their marriage sort of started off on a really, you know, big lie, and so it was maybe a harbinger for things to come.
Hmm. Well, then let's sort of do stepping stones in the timeline, the big events. What year are they're married in? Uh,
1976.
oh, okay. And what happens? What are some of the dates that sort of mark how the story unfolds?
Yeah, so fairly quickly, things start to sort of change, and Jim buys a house in Shirley Hills, which is, very white, very affluent part of Macon, and, brings Lita down there. And it was sort of, pretty shocking at the time. The neighbors were, not only is this Boston guy come and taken over, this sort of long ingrained Maconites business, he's now bringing a black wife to Shirley Hills. So that was sort of a big, kind of a risky thing, and also a lot for Lita to have to deal with. But keep in mind, she was, her family had been sort of working across, the political spectrum and racial lines for a long time. So she was really used to navigating white spaces. But this was a big challenge, and fairly quickly he, started sort of some cracks started happening in the marriage, and he, suddenly was very, very, very like ridiculously frugal at home, and then really extravagant outside of the house. She quickly realized that he was, cheating, but lying about it. So sort of the gaslighting started, and then they started this kind of, cycle of he would cheat, she would, accuse, and then he would buy expensive jewelry as an apology, and around they went. And then in 1982, without telling Lita, and he was getting tired of Macon, and without telling Lita, bought a 17,000 square foot mansion in Palm Beach, Florida. So this is like right down the road from, today's Mar-a-Lago. There's, 17,000 square feet, like I said, and then a tunnel that goes under the highway to your own private beach. And it was just a step up in all ways. And at the time, the population of Palm Beach in 1982 was 0.1% Black. So very, 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 white, another white space that he brought Lita to. And, for a while it kind of reinvigorated their relationship, but then, things started to sort of take a turn again. And he realized that in Palm Beach, there were sort of big barriers. By having a black wife was, a real sort of albatross to his aspirations in Palm Beach. And so, Lita began to feel a little bit more and more isolated and alone. She convinces Jim to buy a condo in Buckhead, Georgia, which is, Buckhead's a neighborhood of Atlanta, and also another, affluent white place. And but she's, coming to Atlanta a lot to visit her family, and so now she has a place to go. And she begins spending more and more time in Atlanta. And then in, 1985, she comes back from a trip and finds another woman's lingerie in their marital bed. And, as I say in the book, it's kind of the bra that broke the camel's back. And
A
she
great
said,
line.
thank you. And she sort of said, that's it. I'm out. I can't do this anymore. So she hitched a U-Haul trailer to her Mercedes and drove back to Atlanta. And a few days later, filed for divorce.
And then 2 years of legal, high stakes legal battle because he's worried he's going to lose half of his fortune. And then uh, that's the prelude to the murder, which takes place when?
So like you said, they're battling for a couple of years. He's made sure that all of their properties, they have the Macon house, the Palm Beach house, the Atlanta house, they have cars, everything is in his name. And so he's trying to desperately sort of keep everything. And she's not asking for much. She's just asking for, after 10 years of this volatile marriage, for, what would have been considered more than fair. But he fought it every step of the way. And then on the day that a judge was to decide on the division of assets, so it was kind of a big court date in the process. Lita's at her condo in Atlanta, and it's January 16th, 1987. She's just turned 35 years old. She's been battling this divorce, but feeling sort of like herself again, and her life is kind of coming back to her. And a man knocks on the door or rings the doorbell at 8 o'clock in the morning, and she opens up to see a man holding a long white box with a big pink bow around it. And eyewitnesses later here report that she said, good morning to this man, and he shoved his way into the foyer and shot Lita. And the first shot missed her, and then the investigators later, surmised that she'd held up the flower box to kind of block the second bullet, but of course that didn't work. And so the bullet hit her in the skull, and she died at the hospital she was born at 20 minutes later. So this was a really, really, really big and tragic case in Atlanta. She was from a very well-known family, and having this kind of murder happen at the time and the place was just so unusual and terrifying. People didn't know what to make of it.
Hmm. Well, let's mention one other important character, Tony Harwood. Who's he?
So Tony Harwood is a guy who grew up in Albemarle, North Carolina, which is a sort of mill town, and he grew up in a family with extreme poverty, and he was a rough and tumble kid. Spent his formative years in prison himself, and then got out and was a long haul trucker. And he was, it turns out, the hired gun, who was the one who delivered flowers to Lita and shot her. But we didn't know about him after the murder. He just absolutely vanished. The hitman vanished, and the investigators believed that there were three people involved: the shooter, the driver, and the person who bought flowers. And it was interesting because all of the eyewitness descriptions were sort of competing, like none of them really matched. So they figured there were three people. But it took another 11 years. It wasn't until 1998 where a woman in Texas contacted the FBI, or the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, the GBI, and said, she'd seen a show on television that it had the family and their lawyers like pleading for information. This is now, 11 years after the murder, and she sees pictures of Jim Sullivan on this television show, and says, I know that guy. He gave my former boyfriend an envelope full of money back in, a decade ago. So the GBI, rushed to Texas to talk to this woman, and then basically wire her up and get her calling her former boyfriend Tony, and get him talking enough so that they feel like they've got him. And so they go knock on his door in April of 1998, and very first thing he says to them is, "I've been waiting for you boys for a long time."
Mm.
So Tony gets arrested, and he says that, and he tells the police that Jim Sullivan paid him to have Lita killed. And Jim had always been sort of a prime suspect, but had, money and resources to hire excellent lawyers to sort of keep, made all sorts of allegations, including that, her family was out for her life insurance, or that Lita was, involved in all sorts of nefarious activities. So it's doing a lot to sort of put the, investigators in a different direction. But then they get Tony, and Tony says, yes, Jim paid me to do this murder. And Jim vanishes. And so suddenly, they've got the hitman. They're coming for Jim Sullivan, and he is gone. And they trace him. He owns a place in Costa Rica, so they trace him to Costa Rica. But by the time the U.S. Marshals get there, he's gone from there. So for another 5 years, he's on the FBI's most wanted list. Interpol's looking for him. And, it seems like yet again, he's just going to skate away and get off. So it's a real devastating hit for the family. And, there's everybody in Atlanta knows about this case. And it's just like, oh my God, why is this continuing on?
Well, and that ties to the subtitle of your book is Race, Power, Privilege, and the Murder of Lita McClinton. Is the effect of race, power, and privilege what delays justice in this, or is it a case that might just have gone unsolved like other cold cases because there wasn't enough evidence, that there wasn't a way to convict? What's your understanding of how those factors affect how long it took for justice to be done?
Yeah, I think there was an overwhelming amount of circumstantial evidence, but they didn't have the hitman, they didn't have the weapon, they didn't have any kind of a paper trail that tied Jim to anyone or anyone else. So I think that that had a big factor in it, but at the same time, there was certainly enough to I mean, a lot of people, including the U.S. district attorneys, believe that there was enough to prosecute Jim much, much, much earlier. But you're a white man who has wealth. I mean, and let's face it, we give white wealthy men the benefit of the doubt in ways that we do not give to any other part of the population. So, and also he's able to hire the best of defense attorneys in the country. He's able to, file for motions and delays, and so it just sort of goes on and on and on. And he got at one point. It's a crazy story. There's so many twists and turns, but sometimes it's hard to talk about literally because there's just so many that happen. But at one point, he's put under house arrest, and anybody else would have probably been put in prison. And there's just a lot of instances like that. And then I think that Lita was a Black woman living in luxury in a white neighborhood. And even the, Black detectives who were first on the scene were sort of like, what's going on here? So somehow, Lita not only had to kind of be exceptional to be seen in these white spaces that she was put in her life, but she also had to be that in death. She had to, it was almost as though it was sort of surmised that she must have had something to do with her own murder.
Mm.
And so I think that, you look at that bias and you extend it to, white judges, white lawyers, white police officers, white reporters, and you can't help but think that level of bias was brought into the story as it was told and unfolding for many, many years. And, when Jim Sullivan was finally apprehended in July of 2002, he is living a life of luxury in Thailand, 80 miles south of Bangkok. And, he fights extradition for a couple of years before he's finally brought back to Atlanta to kind of face the music. And again, is able to hire, the best defense attorneys. And it was touch and go. Was he going to be able to get free again? And so, I think that we see it all the time, that if you have money and the color of your skin, you look at just the disparity. You can't help it, especially, when I said looking at stories from this later time perspective, you sort of look at it and go like, well, how was this fair? And so I really wanted to examine, where are the injustices in the way people are convicted of crimes.
Hmm. The prologue is gripping. You're there waiting for your chance to talk to the hitman, and you send a text to somebody saying, "I'm about to have this meeting with a hitman." And but there's also something really intriguing. You said that you'd been pulled into the story by police reports, news stories, court documents, and then you add, "What really climbed under my skin was the humanity and depravity of it all. What makes people become who they are? What leads us to the choices we make?" And I guess, did you get any answers that satisfied yourself to those questions, or in living with this story so intimately, especially in the writing of the book? Uh, what does make people become who they are? How did this guy from an apparently decent family in South Boston end up in this, and the choices that fascinated me, and it made me wonder, what did you learn as the payoff to the investment in time and effort and just living with really hard facts? What did you learn about it?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think you look at well, the title of the book is "A Devil Went Down to Georgia," and of course that's a Charlie Daniels song, or a riff off of a Charlie Daniels song. But if you look at what is the devil, and it could be Jim Sullivan, it could be Tony Harwood, it could be, um, I think overwhelmingly it's about greed. And it can blind you and make you do crazy things. And like you said, Jim Sullivan had a very successful life in South Boston, had 4 children, was married to his high school sweetheart, was working as an accountant, seemed to kind of have, if not a dazzling life, certainly a full one. And then his uncle calls and says, "I need somebody to take over this business." And like everything changed. It's almost like Jim saw those dollar signs as a way to escape a life that, maybe was a little more boring than he wanted, and suddenly kind of realized that. So, but it seemed to change him, dramatically. And I think that you can get blinded by your desire, and just in the same way that, Lita was a little bit blinded by Jim's, uh, a promise of this, like, pretty exciting life too. They did a lot of traveling, and they did a lot of, pretty awesome charitable events and things like that. So there were good times as well. And I think that sometimes, again, when you're in the thick of it, it's hard to see. And then, when I met with Tony Harwood, I met with him, and I describe it in the book, in a desolate parking lot in Albemarle, North Carolina. And it kind of was probably not my most um, stellar moment in terms of planning, but he showed up, and he's now, in his 70s, and has had a really, really hard life. And not to give too much sympathy to him, and certainly there's a lot of people who have a hard life who don't end up killing people. And but you can also sort of, it made me see him as a bit more human than I had. And the assumptions that I made about him uh, got a little murky, because you look at somebody who's been brought up in an environment where most people are in prison, or drug addiction is a thing, and alcoholism, and how do you get out of that? And I think so he had this opportunity in his mind to get out of that by accepting money from this rich white man who lives in this dazzling mansion in Florida. and suddenly that blinds him to choices, and not to forgive it, um, but maybe to try and understand it a little bit more. I think when you're in something like that, we've all made terrible decisions, and some of us have to pay a lot more for them, and some decisions are much more terrible than others. But it's interesting how greed can change you.
Hmm. Now, you tried to get a hold of Jim Sullivan and he never replied. Uh, do you think that if you'd had a chance to talk to him the way you talked with Tony, that your view of him might have become a little murkier and the way he's portrayed in the book might have been uh, complicated by encountering him as a person?
Yeah, I mean, one of the over the years, I frequently thought about Jim Sullivan because he's in prison, and here's a guy who lived in extreme wealth, and now lives in a 6 by 8 cell in Augusta, Georgia, and has for what is it, 17 years now, and I think that I would have loved to get his side of the story, for all evidence that I have seen or heard, or interview transcripts or people that knew him. Um, he might never have taken accountability. And so it would be really, really curious to hear from him. But I think that his actions throughout that whole entire time kind of told us what we need to know.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that I would have got much different out of him.
The moment when you heard from the your editor, the Atlanta magazine editor that assigned you the original story in 2004, uh, there's a quote that say it came in a slow Georgia accent. Well, sounds like maybe it's time to write a book, and you've been carrying around the banker's box full of files for all of that time, and it sounded like you kept those files because something was intuitively tugging at you, saying you're not done with this. But in retrospect, can you uh, sense any more? Where did that intuition come from, and how did you recognize it enough to act on it and not throw away the material? And are you better at getting intuitive prompts now that might do something great for you in 20 years? I mean, that was a pretty key moment in your story in the creating of this book.
Yeah, gosh, I wish I was like just super dialed into my intuition on all things, but I wouldn't say that. I think, you know, so I grew up in Canada and lived in Atlanta for 5 or 6 years during the time that I first originally reported about this. And I grew up in Canada. We had one Black person at my high school, and what I knew about Black culture came from what I observed in the media. So, I every if you really only pay attention to that, you get a different view of what Black culture is and means. So when I first met the McClinton family, and I had been in Georgia working for Lonely Planet doing a guide to Savannah, Charleston, and the Carolina coast, and I was looking into the slave trade and just trying to learn about like how on earth did this happen in our U.S. history and stuff. And so then I met Lita's family in the research of the first article, and they were like no, I mean, they were formidable people regardless of the color of their skin, but they were also really, for me, formidable Black people that I hadn't encountered and I just started learning a lot more about my own assumptions. And then fast forward to the summer of 2020, and I'm living in Portland, Oregon, and people are sort of protesting in the streets around George Floyd, and in Portland, it's sort of seeming like pretty benign protesting, and yet it's portrayed in the media as, riots happening in the streets. And that didn't happen until, federal troops were sort of sent in, and it just really made me think about like how stories are told and what we get of uh, the news is, whatever so and so wants to put in it. And so I started thinking about this story. I've always just thought about the story. It's like I think every journalist has that one that just got you. And I started thinking about, well, why didn't we ever really talk about race when we were writing about it at the time? And what did race have to do with it? And so as I was exploring my own role as a white person benefiting from a white dominant culture, I started sort of wanting to understand Lita's story in a different way and what her life would have been like. So I really wanted to, when I first, wrote about her, she was a bit of a cardboard cutout of a person, and I really wanted to understand what her like life experience was like, and really dig into the story, what happened in all that time.
Hmm. Hmm. Do you still have the banker's box plus all the material that you generated during the writing the book?
I do. It's interesting though, because, in this day and age, I'm so tempted to want to print everything out, but I mean, I have so much information that's in digital form.
Yeah.
So it's sort of like I have, multiple digital banker's boxes. So
It's all in the
the
cloud.
original one. Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Her parents are really striking people as they come across in the book. And a couple of times you just, the tenacity that they had to bring this guy to justice, uh, and that sort of braided in with the grief of losing their daughter. Um, was there a sense of vengeance that they had toward him, or it seemed a little bit cleaner than? I'm sure there was rage. There had to be rage, but I'm wondering if you could have stayed that angry for that many decades without it just ruining your own life, and if they maybe were as motivated or an equal motivating thing was just justice. There has to be justice. And that's something that you can hold on to for a much longer time than just seeking revenge. I'm kind of speculating here, but does that make any sense given what you know about them?
Yeah, you're totally right. They were absolutely not vengeful, and which is amazing considering, this is their son-in-law. And like, at Lita's funeral, the crowds poured out into the streets, and the one person who wasn't there was her husband of 10 years, regardless of whether you're going through a divorce or not. So I think that they they knew from the start that Jim must have had something to do with it, and they wanted to have him be accountable. They wanted justice for their daughter, and were relentless. And I see it now all the time. Like and they had means to also be able to be relentless. And it takes a lot of pressure on the family. And one of the things that I find interesting is that, you sort of go like, why, if you look at a cold case, you go, why, how did it go cold? Like what happened? But you realize that over time, the person holding the sort of thread always changes, right? So
Mm,
somebody retires or they move to a different job, and the box gets put on the shelf, and then somebody else comes in, and there's not sort of, a lot of times there's not like just sort of somebody who's keeping the thread alive, and so it takes this new person coming in, and or new group of people or whatever coming in, and sort of picking up all the pieces again, and they're losing the context of the original, investigators. So I can see how cases get cold, and I can also see how it's the onus sort of goes on to the families to just keep pushing, 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 pushing. I mean, if not for Emery and Joanne McClinton, I fully believe that this case would still not be solved, and no resolution would have come. And they were just, Joanne was on the Georgia State legislature. Emery was an executive at the Department of Transportation. They were just really formidable people who believed in the justice system, even though it was, a hard road for them. They just wanted, justice for Lita.
Hmm. Now, did Amory pass away before the book was published?
So he passed away in December of 2023.
Hmm.
And but Joanne was incredible and just, really clear and formidable and, as with it as she was 20 years prior, which was amazing. And she said to me, I just want you to tell an authentic story. I think especially with true crime, it can be, you can have the tendency to want to sensationalize things. And so that's what I really tried to do was be really honest and get a lot of different perspectives and so every sentence of the book comes from research. And I felt pretty proud that I was diligent in that way. And uh, it just means a lot to me to have the family appreciate the work.
And I watched I watched some clips from the 2020 and some of the other coverage of the book, and it may be the difference between a book and the medium of TV with the images, but it felt like a lot of that stuff was sensational. As this dramatic music, and they're showing the place where the box of the roses and all that, and when you were trying to avoid it be your book being sensational, you have the flowers and the whole thing, but how did you know what where the line was? How does something that you might have put in the book and maybe you did but you took out to have it be authentic and not be as sensational as what some of the stuff I was watching and getting ready to talk to you seemed to me? It just kind of made my skin crawl.
Yeah. It's strange. Like I think that there is, true crime is this hot genre and has been for a while now. And I think that for me, the sort of more I believe in like economical language. I try to write that way. So the book is kind of just it's very full, but there's not a lot of extra. And so there could have been, and that is, as a writer, you're just constantly deciding, is this right? So I think that I resisted sensationalizing by just being very like, like I said, everything came from research. So I wasn't, trying to,
It was grounded.
yeah, yeah. So I wasn't trying to make anything up. And, there's a few
Hmm.
moments where I, recreate dialogue or something, but that's come from somewhere, a transcript or a news report or an interview. And so keeping to kind of that North Star the whole way made me able to resist. And the story is like fantastical enough. It doesn't
Hmm.
more, it's a crazy story with lots of twists and turns. And it's sort of like you trust it to tell itself in some ways.
Yeah. What a coincidence that the mansion that Jim bought and moved Lita to and that led to the divorce is down the road from Mar-a-Lago, as you say. And now as we enter the second administration of President Trump, does this story help you to understand uh, how you want to be in this period of American politics? I guess I don't really know what the question is I'm asking. I guess it's near Mar-a-Lago, and the book came out just before Trump was elected. Are there any dots there to connect in your way of understanding the country?
Well, you look at, the election was a wealthy white man who had been convicted of crimes and
Okay, I missed that one. That was staring me right in the
well,
face.
and then,
Exactly.
versus a black woman who talk about exceptional,
Right.
right? All the experience, job experience
Mm.
in the whole wide world. And yet, the
Hmm.
narrative is, well, we don't trust her. And,
Yeah.
so, and yet, so we're ascribing a level of, we're okay with him lacking the value system that we, you know, think we want in a leader. But, for a black woman, she had to have, exceptional beyond belief. And even that wasn't enough. So, I mean, I think it's a well-worn. And personally, I feel like, it's a dark time where the patriarchy is doing what it was built to do, and that is elevate the voices and power of white men.
Hmm.
And so it's working just fine. And I am hopeful and dedicated to using the resources and the thing that I have, which is my writing, to keep pointing out that a world that in that a world like that is not um, equitable, smart. It's not working, and I think it's not
Yeah.
working for most of the population. And
Mm.
so I think it was definitely interesting to have all of that be going on in the background while the book was coming out. And um, I think it's important. I think this book echoes what's happening in the world today, and it's 37 years later. So it
Mm.
feels like in some ways we've come a long way, and then in other ways it feels like we haven't moved the needle at all. And the more that I have dug into understanding racism and the country's history around race, the more it's like a bell I can't unring or a thing that I can't see anymore. And so I feel very um, committed to uh, doing my part to call things as I see them.
Have you got another book underway?
I've got a couple things in the works, but
Yeah, right. No need to talk about things before they're ready, but
yeah.
yeah. Well, anything else that we didn't talk about that would be good to make sure gets out on the podcast?
For your listeners, I mean, it feels like sometimes when I do these types of things, I am like giving away the whole story. So what's the point of reading the
Mm.
book? But I think that it is uh, an invitation to just look at things differently, and a worthwhile one to take. So, and then also, I don't know if when this will come out, but it's going to be available on the Kindle Daily deal on
Oh,
February, or no, yeah, February 23rd.
okay.
Um,
What does that mean? I should know that, but it's a book that they make available at a reduced
yeah, it's
price,
like a
or
$1.99. I
oh,
can send you
wow.
the info. But
Yeah,
and
I'll put a link on that for
yeah, and at
sure.
first I said to my publisher, like, is that like being on the, bargain table at Walmart? She's like, no, no, no. It's Amazon chooses. So if somebody buys it, it's the same as if they're buying the full price book, but they get it at the
Yeah.
Kindle version for $1.99. So
You're also up for the equivalent of an Academy Award in the mystery realm. Tell me about how that news came and
oh,
the significance of that.
so I mean, it was a dream of mine to be nominated for an Edgar Allan Poe Award, which, as you say, is sort of the Oscars of mystery and crime writing. And I knew that the nominations came out right around January 19th, which is Edgar Allan Poe's birthday. So I kept sort of looking and checking in, and then I woke up in the morning and grabbed my phone, as you do, and saw that A Devil Went Down to Georgia was one of six nominees in the they call it Fact Crime. And that'll come out, the winner will come out on May 1st. But I'm in company with some pretty awesome writers. So it feels really, really nice just to have, I mean, it's one thing to have your sort of family and friends tell you that your work is good, but something else when a committee of experts really acknowledges it. It's really gratifying. So I'm excited about that.
Well, that's a nice thing too, I would think. And are you in touch with Joanne? Does she know that it got nominated for the award and stuff?
I mean, she's now 93, and
Hmm.
they're really private people. I've heard from a lot of other members of the family, and a lot of people just saying thank you for telling the story and for telling the whole thing, because you kind of get glimpses and pieces of it over time, but this is sort of the only thing the only project that covers the whole thing.
After reading the book and talking with Deb, I can understand why Lita's family is grateful to have this story told so well by an author who took such care to do it with respect, insight, and writerly skill. I liked how Deb mentioned that the person holding the thread of a multi-year cold case like this one changes over time, from the prosecutors to the lawyers. And in her case, she was holding the journalistic thread for this story for more than 20 years, starting from the time that she wrote her Atlanta magazine feature in 2004. I'd say that thread fell into the right hands. If you are interested in reading A Devil Went Down to Georgia, it is now available on Kindle for $17.99. But in just 12 days, the book will be featured as a Kindle Daily Deal, available for $1.99 for 1 day only. After a lengthy hiatus, a few months, the Kindle Chronicles is going to bring you 3 episodes this month, including my recent interview with James McQuivey all about AI. I will travel from here in Sanibel to New York City later in February to work on a special edition on a topic that will be under wraps until then. As always, you can hear what I'm up to and thinking about in my 5-minute morning journal flash briefing on Alexa devices. That's Monday, Wednesday, and Friday of each week. To enable the briefing, you just tell Alexa, enable morning journal. And then the latest episode will play after that whenever you say Alexa Flash. And if you have other flash briefings, they'll be in there as well. I include the morning journal audio file to the Substack newsletter that I publish later in the day on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, along with a brief written post related to the same topic. And you can see that at lenedgerly.substack.com. That's it for this episode of the Kindle Chronicles. Thanks for listening.